Now, please welcome our moderator, Natalie Villacorta. She's a writer from McLean, Virginia. Her fiction and creative nonfiction has been published in Joyland, Hobart, The Offing, Diagram, and Moss. She's an assistant professor of English and creative writing and the director of the Center for Speaking and Writing at Agnes Scott College. Our author, Kimberly Brock, books include The River Witch, for which she received the Georgia Author of the Year Award. She also wrote The Lost Book of Eleanor Dare, and Kimberly was featured in the History Channel's History's Greatest Mysteries. She's the founder of Tinderbach Writers Workshop, and her new book is The Fabled Earth. Our author, Alan Grostephan, is the author of Bogota, a novel chosen by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best 10 books of fiction in 2013 and long-listed for the PEN Robert W. Bingham Prize. He's a professor at Agnes Scott College. He is currently writing about work, disposition, and land restitution in Latin America. His new book is The Banana Wars. Please welcome our authors.
Thank you guys so much for coming, especially at the end of a long day of fun events. Thank you so much to Alan and Kim. You prefer to be called Kim, right? For participating in the I Have a Fiction Addiction panel. So I think it would be really terrific if we could start with having both of you guys read from your novels. And I think before we do that, it might just be helpful to give the audience some synopses of your novels before we jump into it. So Kim, I'll just begin with your novel, The Fabled Earth, since you're sitting right next to me. So The Fabled Earth has two timelines. It follows three characters on Cumberland Island. Anyone here familiar with Cumberland Island? Yes? Okay, wonderful. I'm not from Georgia, so learning about Cumberland Island has been very exciting and interesting, and I hope Kim will talk more about it. So it's an island off of Georgia's coast, and in the first timeline, we start in the summer of 1932 when Cleo Woodbine, an aspiring artist, arrives at Cumberland Island seeking to become the artist in residence at Plum Orchard, a grand mansion owned by the philanthropist Carnegie family. The owner of Plum Orchard agrees to let Cleo have the cottage and be the artist in residence if she attends their annual party as the companion of a debutante, Joanna Burton, who has been promised to one of the young boys who is also going to be in attendance at the party. However, as you might imagine, things go a bit awry at the party, and by the end of the evening, two boys have drowned. Not going to tell you what happens because that is gradually revealed in the other timeline, which takes place in 1959. And we're still following Cleo. She's been living out on this island called Kingdom Come off the coast of Cumberland Island for decades now, working as an artist. She's kind of a recluse. Everyone thinks she's kind of a hermit and a weirdo. And Joanna's daughter, Joanna is the debutante who Cleo had befriended back in 1932. When Joanna dies, her daughter, Frances Flood, comes to Cumberland Island seeking Cleo, and gradually what happened on that mysterious night in 1932 is revealed. So, with that little bit of teaser, Kim, would you please read for us from The Fabled Earth?
Thank you.
And also, if you'd like to add anything to the synopsis, please, by all means. We'll get into more.
So there are three women in this novel, and their lives intertwine around this mystery from 1932. Cleo's the main character, and you see her as a girl in 1932, and then later in 1959, and Frances Flood. And then there's a third character, Audrey Howell, who is a 20-year-old high school graduate. You know how in 1959 you graduated in your wedding dress. So she was married right out of high school and is already widowed. And she's running an inn in town and taking photographs around town. And one of her photographs sets off sort of a search for what happened in 1932. Cleo's grandfather is a folktale artist and writer. And he publishes a little book when he lives in that cottage that the Carnegie family funds. And they publish 200 copies of this little book, and it makes him kind of famous. And he's larger than life in her mind. So when we traveled to Cumberland Island, I looked at that island and I thought, this is a place to write a ghost story. And I liked the idea of how our folklore follows us and how ghost stories follow us. And I thought maybe I wanted to write about a character whose folk tales literally followed and haunted her. So that's what this is. Long before she took up as artist in residence at Woodbine Cottage, her grandfather had been the first to hold the post. The Carnegies of Plum Orchard had been his benefactors, those old gods, with their wild fortune now dwindling away. Dooley Woodbine was a first-generation Scotch-Irish immigrant whose family had settled in Kentucky, and there he'd been a childhood friend of Marius Johnston, who later married Nancy Carnegie. And when he'd invited Dooley to Georgia, Dooley brought his own wife, a practical girl from Brunswick, and his favorite Scotch-Irish folk tales and fables in his red head, like some people bring relatives who cling and settle too close. And while living in the cottage, he'd fathered his own son, Cleo's father, and written and illustrated a book of his own stories, Woodbine's Treasury of Glories and Grims. There'd been 200 copies printed, and he'd kept only one, which he'd bequeathed to Cleo, along with his love of the shoals. Cleo herself had never traveled farther than the miles that separated Kingdom Come and the place where she'd been raised by parents who had worked in the mills and canneries of Reverie before both dying young. After the heartbreaking loss of their only son and daughter-in-law, Cleo's grandparents had left Woodbine Cottage and come to town to care for her. Only after all her family was gone had Cleo returned to the island, holding out just enough hope for her own future as an artist. She loved to sit on Dooley's knee and listen to him intone the poetic language of ancient Irish myths and Appalachian ghost stories. He'd shown her a book of illustrations by Arthur Rackham, the artist who had influenced him. He'd gifted her with her own pen and India ink, a set of paints, and a fresh pad of special paper, and supplied new ones every year until he died when she was 10. She'd copied the illustrated characters in Woodbines, filling up the pads of paper almost as soon as she received them. And then sometime after Dooley passed, her favorites of those characters took on a life of their own and began to tag along beside her. A friendly spirit named Little Hannah, a ghostly fiddler, and a lonely graveyard guardian, a dog known as the Grim. She'd only added to the canon once since she'd come to the shoals, a gentle giant who slipped through the deep forests and in and out of the light, whom she thought of as the spirit of the island. Dooley had said that all stories were ghost stories, an exchange of spirit between the world and the human heart that rode on an inhale and an exhale. Stories, to Dooley, were elemental, and Cleo couldn't have doubted that truth if she'd tried. She'd imagined all those stories he told, drifting past her heart, slipping around the forest of her bones. It was no wonder the figments of her imagination trailed at her heels. They were good company. As she loitered near Dungeness, little Hannah stayed close as a shaft of that summer light, and the melancholy fiddle tune carried over the shoals. A serenade? No, a reminder she was not alone in her grief. Cleo was grateful for the ragtag bunch of childhood memories she dragged out here with her, and she'd continued to paint them so they might be remembered even after she was gone. Cleo liked to think of the Tamaquans when she came to Dungeness, to remember their story, a native tribe that had long ago made their home in this area and down into Florida. You couldn't find one now if you tried. Although centuries ago, they'd surely never have imagined that would be the case. They'd built a shell ring right where she stood from the discarded oyster shells from their tables, and later when the next fella came along, the place they'd marked as sacred had simply looked like the perfect high spot to build a big house. The way Cleo saw it, there would always be somebody wanting to put his foot on this wild place and claim it. The Carnegies were the latest bunch to think they could do it, but Cumberland would never allow it. Every creature and every structure were temporary guests. So far as she could understand, Dooley had had that right. The story was eternal. And so far as Cleo was concerned, the very element that made up Cumberland. Poor old Dungeness stood witness to some of those stories today, with emptied eyes that stared out at the river like it couldn't remember how on earth it got there. Kids regularly snuck around taking a piss on what had once been a grand dream. And whenever she passed this way, which was more often these days, she'd slip inside and up to the empty library with its empty shelves. Nothing stirred there now, but she liked to stand at the window and look out over the river. Joanna is dead, but I guess you don't need me to tell you that, she said aloud, speaking to the memory of a boy called Loomis Gray, who had loved the forsaken library at Dungeness and briefly been her friend. I just needed to say it. She let herself recall the days when it had seemed their whole lives waited beyond the horizon. But their story had turned out to be a fable, a cautionary tale.
Thank you so much. Okay, Alan, it's your turn. Well, let's hear a little bit about what the Banana Wars is about. So I'll start, and then you can fill in. So the Banana Wars begins in 1990 when banana workers in Yoruba, did I say that? Yoruba, in the northwest of Colombia go on strike. So these workers go on strike and they burn up plantations, they murder managers. It is, it's quite the brutal scene. And we begin in the point of view of Orejas. He's a banana worker who's joined the guerrilla movement. And the book moves between Orejas' perspective and the perspective of three other characters largely. Rafael, who's one of the rich plantation owners who lives safely far away from all the destruction in Medellin. Yeah. Okay. And Jay, an American banana executive who lives in Cincinnati, which I have a fondness for because I lived there before I moved here. And then finally, Jennifer, who is a childhood friend of Orejas, who originally runs a bakery in Yoruba, and she's the wife of another guerrilla worker. So to keep up banana production throughout these strikes, Rafael and Jay, they get mixed up with, I think you could say, some very ruthless paramilitary groups who they pay to cleanse the area of guerrillas. And at some point in the novel, Orejas switches to the side of the plantation bosses, and he soon finds himself hunting the very people who he once fought beside. All right.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would amend a little bit is I don't think they get mixed up. I think it's a plan.
Yeah,
right?
they're
yeah.
intentional.
So,
but I guess I use mixed up because they get more than they paid for, maybe.
I think they want every bit of it.
They want every bit.
Yeah. So the idea is not just a cleansing of guerrillas, but a cleansing of people who occupy land that they would like, right, to exploit and plant bananas. I'm going to read you a very short passage from chapter 5 of the novel, and it gives you just a little bit on the childhood of one of the characters that Natalie mentioned, who is nicknamed Orejas because he's got big ears. And in this little bit, I don't think we'll even get to his work on the banana plantation, but it gives you just a little bit of his family life. As a child, Orejas watched the banana workers swinging their machetes in the fields around Turbo, or climbing onto the company buses, like his father with his tough hands and burst fingernails and cuts on his forearms, and occasionally a gash in his leg from an errant machete swipe. By the time his father arrived home drunk, raving about how he was going to El Monte to join the guerrillas, to take back what had been stolen from him, the land, the heads of cattle, the automobiles, the sunglasses, the good rum from Caldas, he had spent every last peso on beer. It was not even worth it to say he was robbed. No one would believe him. Orejas' mother beat him over the head with a broom. His father beat her back with his fists, never hitting her face because she was beautiful, ageless despite the birth of 6 boys. The next morning, Orejas would see her washing clothes in just her underwear, and she looked like a leopard with greenish bruises down her back and stomach and arms. Other nights, his father would come home with a hen and a crate of eggs and a sack of potatoes and yuca. They would have a feast. Those nights, in the years before his father disappeared, were happy, but might not have existed, as if Orejas had made them up to feel less disappointed in his boyhood. What he remembered most was that his father was always worn out, his feet dirty, his eyes bloodshot, and his breath terrible with hunger. Orejas loved the birds along the river, and for a time he thought he could sing. It was the romantic salsa on the radio, but his father told him to quiet down, and the priest never chose him for the choir because Orejas was too dark and would stick out. Orejas thought maybe he would be a doctor because the doctor in town drove a jeep. Neighbors stepped aside on the road and paid for his beer and asked him questions about the body, and he obliged by drawing out their organs on napkins and feeling men's sides and prescribing the little white pills that could cure everything. But when he told his father this, his father shook his head and said that as much as he wanted it, no child of his would ever be a doctor. Best not to live in the clouds, his father said. He gazed down at his bare, deformed feet, airing out after a day in the heavy rubber boots, and he said everything they needed was on the ground. The ground in Uruá, especially near Turbo, was fertile. There were rivers everywhere you looked. Drop in the rhizomes, and up came the banana plants. And the people were not slaves anymore. His father had lived through the early days, working 18-hour shifts, sleeping on a collapsed banana box. Now he had a cement house and earned extra pay as a banderillero, who held up the long metal location pole in the banana fields so the fumigation planes knew where to spray. Even then, the guerrillas were everywhere. By day, there were farmers and laborers working the fields with everyone else. But at night, they kidnapped policemen, took unused land from the plantations, and gave it to landless farmers. A shopkeeper kept a catch of rifles in a hole beneath his shelves and would not sell to the police or the military or the mayor. A school teacher handed out flyers at the cantina and met workers at a boarded-up house in Apartado. Men came from the center of the country, Santander and Bogotá, and educated the people to no longer accept the conditions of their lives. Orejas looked east up into the green Sierra de Avive and imagined the guerrillas moving on the narrow foot trails, setting up tents and kidnapping inspectors and hauling out sacks of marijuana to be shipped north from Turbo, along with the bananas. The communists, his father said, were men with a vision. They could talk to the owners of the plantations and open the ledgers and show them what percentage should belong to the workers risking their lives in the drainages or hauling a dozen stems on the pulley with a rope tied to their waists. If the owners did not listen, they would spill their blood. If you cut the rich, gold flowed from their veins. They looked at all the people like they were negritos or indios who should be grateful for wages higher than anywhere else in the country, for the grid of the new roads and canals and the cable system, implemented for the good of the people and the economy. Ya no, not anymore, his father said. They can't force us to work through the night. Ya no, ya no. He said this about a lot of things, as if his life and the life of Urabá had turned some corner and would never look back at the 18-hour days and 7-day weeks and rotten hammocks hanging in buggy barracks and the women giving birth right there in the dirt because there were no hospitals yet. Don't ever repeat what your father says at home, his mother said. Don't repeat what anyone says, his mother said, or try to understand it. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, so one thing that both of these novels have in common is that they're a lot about a place, and a place that neither of you are from. So Kimberly, your novel is a lot about Cumberland Island, and Alan, obviously your novel takes place in Colombia. And I was just curious if you could tell us a bit about how you both got interested in writing about these places. What was the origin of these projects?
Yeah, sure. I think the origin of, the first time I ever heard the word Urabá was I was living in Bogota, and a friend of mine asked me to be a wedding photographer, and which I'd never done, but I was doing a lot of photography for a nonprofit I worked for. He was from Urabá. And at that party, there were, a bunch of friends of his from childhood, and we hung out and we talked, and this is in the year 2000. And so that was sort of the first time I ever heard anything about Urabá. And then years passed. I think I lived in Bogota for about 3 years, and I think I was, during this time, thinking about bananas occasionally, and where they come from, and sort of Colombia's relationship with them. And in 2016, I went to see this old friend. He was living in Quibdó. He was in Chocó. So to get to Urabá, I first went to him. He was on the Pacific coast, and we sat and talked for days and days. And then he hooked me up with all these contacts in Urabá. Flew to Urabá. I was there for a number of weeks, met people, and then the book is dedicated to another really old friend who's also from there. And so I just kept traveling back. I read a lot of history, and I just traveled around and talked to people. That's kind of the origin. And I think as I, through all these different contacts, I went to banana plantations. I felt like people really wanted to talk to me. People really opened up about this history. And when I was living in Colombia in 2000, it wouldn't have been possible. It was a time of total silence. Urabá and Turbo, apart de all these place names that I mentioned in the reading, were completely paramilitarized. And which basically meant there was a rule of silence. And it was very dangerous. So when I was there in 2016, it was like things were opening up a little bit. It was still in a quieter way, I think, paramilitarized. But that's sort of how that's what got me going into the book. Yeah.
Kind of a desire to tell a story that had been silenced for a long time in a way.
I mean, maybe. That sounds like a lofty idea. I don't know. I think I was just interested in the history, and I thought, well, I think I went there and, immediately all these things happened, right? I mean, I went to a banana plantation. The agronomist who took me there was a childhood friend of my friend Raul, and it turned out he was like a hardcore right-wing paramilitary. And so I was suddenly in that mindset, right? I was walking the plantation with him, and his theory was that this was good, that like thousands of people had to die and be dismembered and tortured and raped to get to modernity, right? And I was like, whoa. I texted my friend Raul and I was like, your buddy is quite the paraco, and he's like, yeah, he kind of went a right turn in life. So, and then I was staying with his friend Lourdes, this woman who lived in Apartado, and it was the opposite story, right? So anyway, but I just thought, there's a really big story here. And I think when I was there, I thought I want to do a nonfiction piece. And then I talked to my agent, and she said, no, you should do a novel. And then I thought, that's the thing I know how to do anyway, right? That's what I'll do. Yeah, so. It's funny, when you look back, there's like a logic, you try to make sense of it, right? But when you're in the middle of it, you're just bumbling around mostly. Or at least that's how I feel.
Sounds familiar. So, and yet so different. And that's what, I've not read your entire book, but I've read parts of it. And that was the thing. There's such different stories, but you can see, or I can see, how you connect with it personally, like why that was important. And we have things in common, like she's saying about place. So I know you can't tell listening to me talk, but I'm from North Georgia. So I'm from the foothills of Appalachia. I grew up on a farm, and I took my first trip to the beach, probably 3 years old, because my dad's best friend had a house on St. Simon's. And so I loved it. And he was the one that brought my mother books to read. And so I kind of learned a love of reading from this man, and I associate it with that region. So here's the weird part. This is where that thing takes a turn, where you don't know you're going to write about a place. I can remember we got married in 1996. And we got married in the backyard. I grew up on a farm. We got married under a tree that was built or planted the same year the house was built in 1912. I wore a Sears and Buck Roebuck 1912 wedding dress that we found the weekend before, and the little old ladies made pound cake for the wedding. There were 25 people in folding chairs. It was small. And I loved it. So then a few months later, the news, like everybody in the world, found out at the same time that JFK Jr. had married Carolyn Bessette on Cumberland Island, and this secret little wedding. And I remember thinking, well, we're just like us. We're just like the Kennedys. And I'm not really a person who's into like celebrities or whatever. I don't remember thinking a whole lot about it, but I remember being charmed by it and thinking I'd like to go to Cumberland Island one day and see this place, because how strange to have this. It's a national park now, and it's mostly undeveloped still, but the Carnegie family had built these Gilded Age mansions there, and they must have looked like elephants had been dropped from the sky. They didn't belong there, and I wanted to see them because that seemed so strange to me. So on our 25th wedding anniversary, we went. My husband dropped a mortgage payment, and we went to stay at the Grayfield Inn because I won't camp. Sorry. and we stayed there, and you go by a private ferry, and it's very elite, and like I did not belong in that environment at all. I did not know how to be there with this accent and like all of that money. But we pulled up alongside the island, and the island is beautiful, and it's definitely wild, and it feels like you're outside of time and space and all the trees and the Spanish moss. And I remember a few years after we were married, that plane crash. And I remember being kind of obsessed with that. I had lost a friend in college, and when that plane crashed, it triggered a lot of that grief and the horror of a young person dying. And so when we pulled up alongside the island, I suddenly remembered it. And I thought, oh, this would have been their 25th wedding anniversary too. And all the hairs stood up on my head. And I thought, wow, if I was ever going to write a story that was about ghost stories, this is where it should be. And I thought about how our stories connect us and how they travel across space and time. And this setting seemed correct for that too. There's a place in the river, like all tidal creeks, where the tide runs both ways. And I think that's what a story is. I think it's a spirit that it's a community. It connects us in community. We're part of that. The way that we have to be able to reflect on the past, and we also have to be able to dream about the future and exist in a fixed point at the same time, all of it at the same time. And so I decided to write about this place that has this long, embattled history. It looks beautiful, and it looks mythical to you. It feels that way, and yet there's a lot of blood in the soil. There are always people scrambling to the top of the hill to try and call it home. There's a lot of exploitation. The history is strange and long, and it's haunted. There's a lot of ghosts.
That's a perfect transition, thinking about how long and complicated the history of Cumberland Island is, because I was reading an interview with you, Kimberly, and I know a little bit about your research process, Alan, and I know that y'all had a lot of information to work with in writing these books. And I'm curious, how do you not get swamped and weighed down by all the research? How do you move from the research process gathering facts, interviewing people, reading histories of the place, and into creating a narrative, creating characters, creating a plot. Hard one. Sorry. We only have 15 minutes, so I'm getting into the meat of it.
I am not a historian. I'm a storyteller. So that's my cheater answer, right? And I am kind of like a crow. I like shiny things. And so I do all this research and I pick out different shiny things and I'll jump from one thing to the next thinking, ooh, this is where the story is. Ooh, this is where the story is. Ooh. And eventually what happens is I'll have it all piled up around me like a crazy person. And then I barely use any of it to write the story. It will sneak its way in, but I write a character-driven story. So information about place and history more or less informs the character rather than the other way around. And I think that's probably true because you're writing fiction too. And I think I want to stay as close as I can to the true history, but I'm not writing fact. And when it comes down to it for me, as a fiction writer, I'm tormented by that. I think if you're writing nonfiction and if you're writing historical fiction like I am, where you're trying to get all those facts correct, they're really important to me. But because that's the what of your story. Because I'm a fiction writer and I'm character driven, the torment is that all I do is go, why? I want to know why the people are doing what they're doing, or why the story's been told a certain way, why some of the stories are left out. And so that's more or less what I do. I go through and I look at what I have from all of that long, vast history, and then I look at the person that I'm trying to attach to, that I want my reader to know and understand, and I try to answer that question, why? Now tell him something smarter.
No, I don't know. I'm just trying to think, that's really good. I'd like to add something to that. I think one of the things what happens when you're doing research, and you have all this history, is that you just have an excess of stuff, right? That you kind of want to fit into the book, but then you feel it when you're forcing it in, and so you kind of want it. It's almost like the famous Hemingway thing about the iceberg. It's there, even if it's not there, right? Just the way you're writing everything, it's below the surface. You can feel it. And, I knew I wanted this American character in the book, this Chiquita banana executive. And he was the hardest to write because I had to force him into the book. Whereas like someone like Jennifer, who Natalie mentioned, who, is widowed early in the book and runs a bakery and then eventually starts working at a banana plantation. She came out of nowhere, and I think the research sort of informed everything going on around her, but she was very magical to me in that every time she was on the page, everything kind of lit up. And there was no logical way to find her. She just came out in the writing. But yeah, and there is a moment maybe where, I don't know, you can complicate a book with too much, if you know too much about it, and and you want to get all the different layers of history in there, and then kind of what you're saying, then you kind of look what's best for the story, right? Yeah.
Thank you. You guys both mentioned, that in the research process, there's all kinds of gems and nuggets that you learn that you don't have a place for in the book. There's no room for it. Doesn't fit into the story. Doesn't fit with the characters. Would you both share with us, as our last little bit here, some piece of research that you encountered that you think is just really fascinating, that you didn't get to put into the book?
I can't think. Now I'm blank. Okay, you go first. Let me think. I'm in charge. I'm sitting in the middle.
No, you're good. I don't know if I put this in or not, but we were just hanging out with a friend here who's talking a lot about the banana history in near Santa Marta, Colombia, and Magdalena Medio, which is, if anyone's read 100 Years of Solitude, there's a banana massacre, and that's early in the 20th century, whereas Urabá kind of emerges in the 1960s, 70s, and it's a totally different type of, the way this industry gets founded and built, it's just completely different. And the people who buy up the land and push people off the land and clear it, because it was mostly jungle, are all from Medellin, right? They're what in Colombia they call paisas. So the paisas arrive, and there's this big contrast of who's paisa and who's not there. And one of the kind of interesting things is they did this with the help of Americans. The Americans dredged the banana canals, the big, United Fruit and the American banana companies dredged the banana canals, helped them clear land, brought in all this machinery from Central America. And the minute you cut a banana off the stem, it belonged to an American banana company. So the Colombians were just doing the work on the ground, and they had a contract in order to get this whole thing started. Then those bananas were exported. They were on their way. The contract expired in I think it was in early 1970s. And the Americans presented this just horrific contract to take advantage of the economic situation and said, if you guys don't sign it, you're not going to be able to export to the United States. Good luck, right? Selling your bananas to the world. And because these businessmen and women, right, these founders from Medellin, they were pretty savvy, they said, well, we're not going to sign it. And they kind of pulled it off. They created their own export industry. So for about a decade, the Americans were not there. And so my book kind of starts when they're back. They're coming back, which is exactly what happened. Chiquita formed a subsidiary named Banadex, and they wanted to reinvest in Colombia and be back in the region and get their bananas out of there. But they had a really tough negotiating partner, right? I mean, they couldn't just do what they did in the the turn of the century, 1910, 1920s. So that's a little bit in the book, but I was very fascinated just by that. The more I read about the contracts, the per banana prices, all just the economics of it, I was very into the details of it. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's not. That's, you're making me think and making me think about what my answer is. And it is the detail. It's that you enjoy, when you're doing that research, learning all the details. First of all, I can't even tell you the lineage of the Carnegie family. We all know Andrew, but this is about his brother Tommy, because it's a Southern story, so I'm writing about Tommy, right? And his wife. And then they had 9 children. 9. Can't even keep up with all the names. Her name was Lucy, and there are 3 million other little Lucy Carnegies that come along in the next generations. So I couldn't really talk about all of those people without getting in a quagmire of them. And that's that one family. If I started going back and looking at the history of Cumberland Island and how it just rolls century after century after century back to the indigenous people that were there, and I wanted to tell my readers everything about that. I wanted to tell you about the Dungeness mansion, and I wanted to tell you about when the Carnegie family came and bought it. They literally bought it from a cousin of Jefferson Davis. How do you fold all of that in and keep the reader interested in your fictional characters? Because the reality is so insane. And so you have to leave a lot of that out and kind of tuck it in places where you can. And ghost stories and folklore and all those specifics about the Irish folklore, all of that. I hated leaving out the specifics sometimes, and you hope that your broad strokes do the job.
Okay, one specifics I'm curious about. In the Dungeness mansion, was there really an indoor pool that had acrobat bars in it?
There was really an indoor pool that had acrobat rings that hung across, and the water was really sulfur water. So hell on earth, it seemed like to me.
It's just so fascinating.
It's creepy.
To me. Yeah,
I couldn't make up the Southern Gothic. And I'm sure that you're I couldn't even have made up this setting. It's so real already, and then rich and horrible and wonderful. And so you're just picking and choosing and hoping that it makes somebody curious, that they want to learn more.
Definitely made me want to go to Cumberland Island and go look at the ruins of the Dungeness mansion for sure. There's just something about ruins that are very intriguing. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. I think we're pretty much out of time. So let's end it there, unless there's anything you guys want to add. Okay. Thank you all so much for coming.